A barn in winter, Vermont. The roof glowing orange from the inside. Black smoke pouring sideways into a sky full of stars. Snow on the ground lit up red by the flames. No sirens yet. No neighbors. Just a wood-frame building going down in the dark. A pickup truck on the shoulder of the road. The driver's door hanging open. Boots in the snow running. Inside the building, a man on the floor, 60 years old, maybe 55, face down by a file cabinet, not moving, and a young man 21 on his belly under the smoke, crawling toward him, outside the wind carrying the smell of burning oil 3 miles down the valley. A sleeping town, a sleeping wife waiting for a phone call that's about to come at the wrong hour, a debt that hasn't been written yet but is already starting to take shape in the snow. A hand reaches out, grabs the back of a coat, pulls. A hand reached into the wall, a young man's hand. Calluses on the knuckles. A black line of motor oil under the thumbnail that no amount of scrubbing would lift. The fingers were steady. The wrist was lean. The forearm was the kind you only get from real work, not from any gym. The hand pushed past a curtain of crumpled newspaper that smelled like dust and old ink and the inside of a barn nobody had opened in 50 years. It pushed past the back of the lath, past a forgotten cobweb, past a generation of silence, and then it touched metal, cold metal, flat, rectangular, the kind of tin a man used to keep his tobacco in when men still rolled their own and the world moved slower. The hand stopped. The young man on the other end of that arm did not breathe for almost 10 seconds. He could hear his own heart inside his ears. He could hear the wood stove ticking in the corner as it cooled. He could hear somewhere outside a crow calling across a hayfield that had not been mowed since June. He did not know yet what he was about to find. He did not know that he was about to lift the lid on something a whole town had buried. He did not know that a promise his father made on a winter night in 1995 in a burning building outside Bristol, Vermont, was about to come back around like a long, slow circle, drawn by an old man with a steady hand. He was 20 years old. He had $1 to his name when this all began, and his name was Silas Calloway. Before we go any further, if you like stories about old men who keep their word and young men who learn how, hit that subscribe button and tell us down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We read every one of them. Now, let me take you back. The first thing you need to know about Silas Calloway is that his father taught him how to use a level when he was 6 years old. Frank Calloway was a mechanic at a small garage on Route 7 outside Burlington, Vermont. He was a quiet man, the kind of quiet that came from working with his hands every day, the kind of quiet that came from knowing that words rarely fix what's broken, but tools sometimes do. Frank had a workbench in the basement, a green metal one with a vise on the right end and a pegboard above it where every wrench hung in its own outline drawn in black marker so you'd know if one was missing. That basement on a Saturday morning in March of 2012 smelled like sawdust and coffee and the faint sweet rot of an apple core somebody had thrown in the wastebasket and forgotten about. Silas was 6. Frank set a piece of pine on the workbench, 12 inches long, 2 inches wide, rough on the edges. He took a small wooden level from a drawer and laid it on the wood. "Look down it," he said. His voice was low. He never raised it. Not once. Not in the 9 years Silas had him. Silas closed one eye. He squinted along the edge of the wood the way his father showed him. The pine was straight. The bubble in the level sat right between the 2 black lines. The morning light came through the small basement window in a single yellow bar and fell across the level and the wood and his father's wide brown hands. "A man," Frank said very quietly, "doesn't have to say much. He just has to finish what he promised." Silas would remember those hands his whole life. He would remember the burn scar that ran in a long pink stripe down the inside of his father's right forearm, from the elbow to the wrist. He would remember the place on his father's left hand where the pinky finger never quite straightened out anymore. He would remember asking once how those happened. He would remember his father just smiling and saying, "Long time ago, don't worry about it." He never did get an answer, not as a boy. Frank Calloway died on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 2015. Lung cancer. He had never smoked. The doctors at the hospital in Burlington said sometimes it just happens. There was no warning. 2 months from the first cough to the last morphine drip. He went fast. He did not complain. He was 41 years old. Silas was 9. The house got very quiet after that. The kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful. The kind of quiet that was just absence dressed up in normal clothes. The basement door stayed closed. The workbench stayed where it was. The pegboard outlines stayed empty for almost a year before anybody touched a wrench again. Marlene Calloway. Silas's mother sold the garage. She did not know how to run it, and there was no one to teach her. She got a job at a hospital reception desk and started wearing makeup again after about a year. Silas saw her cry exactly twice in the year after Frank died. Once at the funeral, and once standing in the kitchen on Christmas morning holding a coffee mug, looking at nothing. By the time Silas was 11, his mother had a new boyfriend. His name was Dale Mercer. Dale was 46. Dale sold auto parts at a wholesaler off I-89. Dale had thick forearms and a thick neck, and opinions about everything from politics to how a man ought to mow his lawn. He moved into the house in the spring of 2017 with 3 duffel bags and a flat-screen television and a smell about him like cheap aftershave layered over warehouse dust. Dale never hit anybody. You need to understand that. He never put a hand on Silas, never put a hand on Marlene. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't disappear for weeks at a time. But Dale had a voice that filled a room the way smoke fills a room. And he could not stand the ghost of Frank Calloway, even though that ghost did not say a word. The first thing Dale did was move Frank's toolbox out to the shed. Frank's toolbox was a big red Craftsman, 3 drawers, with a brass padlock on it. Frank had bought it the year before Silas was born. It sat in the basement next to the green workbench and the pegboard where every wrench was outlined in black marker. One Saturday in June, while Silas was at a friend's house, Dale dragged that toolbox up the basement stairs and out the back door and into the unheated shed behind the garage. Then he padlocked the shed and put the key on his own keyring. Silas came home and the basement smelled empty. Like somebody had taken something out of a room that had been there so long the air remembered the shape. He didn't say anything to his mother. He had already learned by 11 that saying things in this house made everything worse. The second thing Dale did was cover up Frank's cabinet. Frank had built a small wooden cabinet against the kitchen wall, hand-jointed maple, no nails, just dowels and glue and patience. He had built it for Marlene the year they got married. There was a small heart carved into the inside of one of the doors. You had to open it to see. Dale didn't like the look of it. He said it was rustic. He said it didn't match. He bought a sheet of white melamine particle board from the big box store down the highway and screwed it right over the front of Frank's cabinet, covering it completely. He framed it out with plastic trim and called it a facelift. Marlene didn't stop him. She was standing at the sink when Dale did it. The water was running. Her hands were in the dishwater. She looked out the kitchen window the whole time and did not turn around. Silas watched from the doorway. That was the day he understood that his mother was already gone. Not physically. She was right there in the kitchen, in her apron, washing the same blue plates she had been washing for as long as he could remember. But the part of her that had been his mother, the part that sang in the car when he was very small, the part that used to brush his hair back from his forehead when he had a fever, that part had walked out of the house when his father did. It just took her a while to notice. The third thing came later. It was the worst. Silas was 13. He was sitting at the top of the stairs one night because he had heard voices, and the voices were about him, and he was old enough by then to know when his name was being said in a room he wasn't in. Dale was in the living room with Marlene. The television was on but muted. Dale was saying something low and steady. The way he said everything when he was trying to make a decision sound like a fact. "The kid is just like his father," Dale said. "Quiet, stubborn, looks at me like I'm dirt on his shoe." Silas held very still on the carpeted step. "That's not a compliment," Dale said. "Marlene, are you listening? That is not a compliment." There was a long pause, and then Silas heard his mother say very softly, "I know." Silas went back to his bedroom and closed the door without making a sound. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. He did not cry. He had used up his crying years ago. He just sat there and listened to the radiator tick and thought about his father's hands and the workbench in the basement and the wrench outlines drawn in black marker on the pegboard. And he made a decision that night that would shape the next 7 years of his life. He decided he was going to save money, and he was going to leave. He just didn't know when. He didn't know it would be on his 20th birthday. He didn't know it would be without warning. He didn't know how. But he made the decision, and then he started. Silas was 16 when he got the job at the Riverbend Diner. The Riverbend Diner sat on Route 7, about 3 miles south of Burlington, in a low white building with a green roof and a parking lot full of pickup trucks. It served breakfast all day. It had a coffee pot that ran from 5 in the morning until 10 at night and never went cold. It had 8 booths along the windows and 12 stools at the counter, and a hand-painted sign over the door that read "Open" on one side and "Open Anyway" on the other. Silas started as a busboy. He carried plates. He wiped down tables. He learned the smell of cooking bacon on a cold morning and the sound of a coffee pot hissing on the burner, and the way regulars come in at the same time every day and sit in the same seats and order the same thing without ever looking at the menu. The cook at the Riverbend was a man named Bernie. Bernie was somewhere in his 60s. He had a gray beard, short, and a tattoo on his left forearm that was so faded you couldn't read it anymore. He had worked in a paper mill cafeteria for 20 years before the mill shut down in 2010. He had been at the Riverbend ever since. He did not speak much. He did not need to. He had 2 volumes, off and occasional. When Silas started, Bernie watched him for about 3 weeks without saying anything beyond "plates up" and "move." Then one slow afternoon, Bernie put a knife in Silas's hand and showed him how to dice an onion without crying. Then how to break eggs one-handed. Then how to tell by listening when bacon was done. By the time Silas was 19, he was working the line. He and Bernie cooked side by side for 4 years. They almost never had a full conversation, but they worked elbow to elbow through 5,000 breakfasts. And a friendship grew in the spaces between the orders. The kind of friendship men sometimes have. Wordless, solid, built out of showing up. Now, there was an old man. He came in every morning at 6:30, not 6:29, not 6:31, 6:30. He was tall once. You could tell that. Time had taken some inches off him, but he still stood straight. White hair under a wool cap, faded green flannel shirt, brown work pants, boots that had been resoled at least twice. His face was weathered the way Vermont faces get weathered, sun and snow and 70-some winters carved into the skin around his eyes. He sat at the corner booth, same booth, every day. He ordered a black coffee and a slice of rye toast with butter. He paid in cash. He left a $2 tip every single morning, whether the service was good or bad, whether the toast was burnt or not. His name was Hank Vance. He was 74 years old. His wife Eleanor had died 3 years before, in 2023, of a stroke that took her in the night. Hank had found her in the morning. He had been alone in the world since. He and Silas got to know each other slowly. the way men of different generations sometimes do. Hank would say something short. Silas would answer, then nothing for a week, then a little more. One morning when Silas brought the coffee, Hank looked up at him and said, "You got hands like a man who knows tools." Silas paused. "My father was a mechanic," he said. Hank looked at him for a long time. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the kind of blue that doesn't tell you what's behind it. "Was," Hank said, just the one word. Silas nodded. "Cancer," he said. "I was 9. Hank looked at the table for a moment. He turned his coffee cup half a turn in the saucer. "That's young," he said. That was the whole conversation that morning. But after that, Hank started telling Silas in small pieces about his wife, about 46 years of marriage, about the morning he found her, about how a man learns slow and hard to make coffee for one. Silas told him in equally small pieces about Frank, about the workbench, about the toolbox locked in the shed. The two men, 54 years apart in age, found each other across the chipped formica of a corner booth at a diner on Route 7. There was something else, too. Hank watched Silas in a way that other customers did not. Not creepy, not strange, just attentive. The way a man watches a horse he's thinking about buying. The way a man watches a fire he's tending. There were mornings when Silas would refill Hank's coffee and look up and find Hank already looking at him, and Hank would not look away. He would just nod. Small. Once. As if confirming something to himself. Silas thought at first that the old man was lonely, that maybe Hank was looking for a grandson he didn't have. Silas was wrong about that, but he wouldn't know how wrong for another 2.5 years. And here is the part that matters. One morning, in the middle of August of 2026, Silas was standing at the cook's window picking up an order. Bernie was on the line behind him flipping pancakes. The window looked straight out at Hank's booth. Bernie did not turn his head. He kept flipping pancakes. But under his breath, just loud enough for Silas to hear over the hiss of the grill, Bernie said, "Be careful with that old man." Silas looked at him. "Bernie." "Not because he's bad," Bernie said. "He's not. He's the best of them. But he's been waiting for somebody. He's been waiting a long time." Silas stared. "Waiting for who?" Bernie flipped a pancake. The smell of batter and butter rose up between them. "I don't know yet," Bernie said. "But you keep your eyes open, son." That was all. Silas carried the plates to the booth. He poured Hank a fresh cup of coffee. He did not say a word, but he looked at the old man with new eyes. And the old man sipping his coffee looked back at him with those pale, washed-out blues, and just for a second, just for a flicker, Silas thought he saw something move behind them, something old, something that had been sitting there a very long time. Now. Silas kept a sock under his mattress. In that sock was every dollar he had managed to save since he was 16. By his 20th birthday, the sock held $612 in folded 20s. He kept the money in his father's old toolbox. Yes, that toolbox. 2 years after Dale locked it in the shed, when Silas was 13, he had figured out how to pick the brass padlock with a piece of wire from a coat hanger. He didn't take the toolbox out. He just opened the lock once a month late at night when his mother and Dale were asleep. He would walk out to the shed in his socks in the dark and lift the lid. He would put his hand on the wrenches. He would smell the inside of that box, which still smelled like his father after all those years, like motor oil and 3-in-1 and a thin trace of pipe tobacco from a pipe Frank had smoked maybe 10 times in his life. When Silas turned 16 and started working at the diner, he started hiding his money in there, inside the old toolbox, inside the bottom drawer, under a tray of sockets nobody but him had touched in 7 years. Dale never went in the shed. Dale didn't like spiders. The toolbox was the only safe place Silas had. He told himself every month when he added another 20 or 40 to the sock that he was building a door. Not a big door, not a fancy door. A door he could walk through when the day came that he needed to. He always knew somewhere deep down that the day was coming. He just thought he'd be the one to choose it. He was wrong. September 14th, 2026. Silas Calloway's 20th birthday. The morning was cold. There was frost on the windshields of the pickup trucks in the diner parking lot. The sugar maples along Route 7 were already turning, the edges of the leaves going orange the way they do up in Vermont a week or two before the rest of the country starts thinking about fall. Silas worked a double, breakfast and lunch. Bernie gave him a slice of pie and a $5 bill at the end of the shift and said, "Happy birthday, son." That was all. From Bernie, that was a whole speech. Hank had come in at 6:30 as always. He had not said happy birthday. Silas had not told him. Silas drove home around 4 in the afternoon in a 2004 Ford Ranger he had bought with his diner money for $1,000 3 years before. The truck was rust around the wheel wells. The heater worked. The radio didn't. He pulled into the driveway of the small ranch house he had lived in his entire life. He saw it before he was even out of the truck. There was a stack of stuff at the end of the driveway, 3 cardboard boxes, a duffel bag, and set carefully on top of one of the boxes his father's red Craftsman toolbox. Silas sat in the truck for almost a full minute with the engine off. Then he got out. He walked up the driveway. His boots were quiet on the asphalt. The afternoon sun was that thin, cold gold you only get in northern New England in mid-September, low and angled, casting long shadows from the maple in the front yard across the lawn. The front door was unlocked. He went inside. The television was on in the living room. Dale was in his recliner with a beer. He did not turn his head. "Time to go, kid," Dale said. He said it to the television. Silas walked past him without speaking. He went down the hall to his bedroom door. There was a brand new padlock on it, shiny silver, the kind you buy at the hardware store for $8. He turned around. He walked through the dining room. He stopped at the kitchen doorway. His mother was standing at the sink. Her back was to him. The water was running. Her hands were in the dishwater, but they were not moving. She had her hair pulled back the way she had worn it for years. She was wearing the apron with the small blue flowers on it that Silas had given her for Mother's Day when he was 8. She did not turn around. She did not turn around. Silas stood in the doorway for what felt like a very long time. The radiator clicked. The faucet ran. Somewhere outside, a crow called. Then he walked back through the house, past Dale and the television and the half-empty beer, out the front door, down the steps, to the end of the driveway. He sat down on the cardboard box that held his clothes. He took out his phone. His hands were steady. His eyes were dry. He had been preparing for this moment without knowing it for 9 years. The only surprise was that it had taken this long. He scrolled to a number he had saved a year ago, a number he had never actually called. It was Hank Vance's number. Hank had written it on the back of a Riverbend receipt one morning the previous fall, slid it across the table, and said, "If you ever need a thing, you call. Don't think about it. Just call." Silas had folded the receipt and put it in his wallet and not thought about it since. He pressed the number. It rang twice. "Hank Vance," the old voice said. Silas opened his mouth. For a second, no sound came out. Then he said, "It's me, Silas." There was a small pause on the other end. Not long. Just enough. "Where are you, son?" "My driveway," Silas said. "I've been kicked out." The pause was even smaller this time. "I'm 45 minutes away," Hank said. "Don't move. Don't go back in that house." The line went quiet. While Silas waited for Hank, he opened the toolbox. He didn't know why. Maybe just to touch the wrenches one more time before he had to figure out the next part of his life. maybe just to feel his father in the cold sunlight. He sat on the box. He set the toolbox on his lap. He worked the brass padlock with the bent piece of coat hanger he kept on his key ring. The lock clicked. He lifted the lid. Same smell. Motor oil. 3 in 1. The faint ghost of pipe tobacco. He ran his fingers down the row of wrenches. He pulled out the top tray. He moved a few of the sockets. There was the sock with the money in it. Still there. $612. Safe. But underneath the tray, way down at the bottom of the box in a corner, he had never bothered to look in since he was 13, his fingers touched paper. He froze. He moved a few more sockets out of the way. He reached down. It was an envelope, yellowed, folded once, wedged down the side of the box, behind the bottom edge of the tray, where it had been sitting for he didn't know how long. He pulled it out. The envelope was sealed. On the front in handwriting Silas had not seen in 11 years, in the slow, careful printing of a man who had not gone past 10th grade, but who took his time with every letter his father had written 4 words. For Silas. When ready. Silas's hands began to shake. He sat there at the end of the driveway, on a cardboard box full of his clothes, on the afternoon of his 20th birthday, holding an envelope his father had written and sealed and hidden for him before he died. He looked at it for a long time. Then he tore it open along the top with his thumb. Inside was a small brass key, like a key to an old desk drawer, or a small lockbox, and a folded piece of lined notebook paper. Silas unfolded the paper. He read it once, then he read it again, then he read it a third time because the words didn't quite make sense the first 2. The handwriting was Frank's. The date at the top was June 11th, 2015, 2 months before Frank went into the hospital for the last time. The note said this: Silas, when you read this, I'll be gone, and you'll be older, and you'll be in a hard spot. I'm sorry I'm not there. Cancer is a thief, and there's no fighting it on its own terms. There's a man in Goshen, Vermont. His name is Henry Vance. Folks call him Hank. He'll be a fair bit older than me by the time you find him. About 22 years older, I think. He'll be old when you find him, but he'll still be sharp. I owe him a debt I never got to pay. He saved my life one winter night in 1995. He never asked for anything back. I always meant to give him something. I never figured out what. Now you go find him. Tell him whose son you are. He'll know what to do. The key opens a lockbox he's got. The lockbox isn't the point. The man is the point. A man finishes what he promised. I promised him I'd be there if he ever needed me. I broke that promise by dying. So now you go. I love you, Silas. I'm sorry. Dad. Silas put the note down on his lap. He looked up. The sky over Burlington was that pale, washed-out blue, the same blue as Hank Vance's eyes, and a thin line of clouds was moving very slowly across it from the west, drifting toward the mountains. A pickup truck turned into the street, a 1989 Chevy, faded red, the exhaust running a little loud because the muffler needed a new clamp. It pulled up in front of the driveway and stopped. The old man behind the wheel rolled down the window. He looked at Silas. He looked at the boxes. He looked at the toolbox. He looked at the envelope in Silas's hand. His face did something. Just for a second. Just for a flicker. The same thing Silas had seen behind those pale blue eyes that morning in the diner. Hank Vance did not get out of the truck. He just leaned across and pushed open the passenger door. "Get in, son," he said. His voice was steady, but it was not the same voice Silas had heard ordering rye toast for the last 4 years. It was the voice of a man who had been waiting 11 years to hear someone knock. Silas stood up. He loaded the boxes into the bed of the Chevy. He loaded the duffel bag. He loaded last and most carefully the red Craftsman toolbox that had belonged to Frank Calloway. He got in the passenger seat. He closed the door. Hank put the truck in gear. Neither of them looked back at the house. They drove south on Route 7 in the long gold afternoon light. The Green Mountains rose up on the left, dark and quiet under the early autumn sun. The fields were full of black and white cows chewing in unison. An old man on a tractor raised one slow hand as they passed, and Silas Calloway, 20 years old and just kicked out of the only house he had ever lived in, sat next to a 74-year-old man he barely knew and listened to the road hum under the tires, and felt for the first time in 9 years like his father was sitting somewhere in the cab with them. He did not know where they were going. He did not know about the schoolhouse in Goshen. He did not know about the tin boxes in the walls. He did not know about Edith Vance, or the Hollow Road Fund, or the night in 1995 outside Bristol when his father had walked into a burning building to drag a stranger out by the back of his coat. He did not know any of it. But he had an envelope on his lap, and a small brass key in his pocket, and a quiet old man at the wheel of a 1989 Chevy pickup, and a long road ahead of him into the dark green hills of southern Vermont. And somewhere down those roads, 60 miles south in a town with one covered bridge and one general store and one white church, a building had been waiting since 1968 for somebody to walk in and sit down and begin. It had been waiting for him. It just didn't know his name yet. They drove south for nearly an hour without saying much. The road climbed and dropped. The road bent around old stone walls and across small bridges where the water below ran clear and shallow over flat brown stones. The hills got steeper. The houses got farther apart. The sun dropped behind the mountains on the western side of the valley, and the light went from gold to that thin gray blue that Vermont gets in the hour before dark in mid-September. Silas did not look at his phone. He did not check to see if his mother had called. He already knew she hadn't. Around 6:15 they came around a bend, and there it was. A small green sign by the side of the road. White letters, faded a little around the edges. Goshen Pop, 287. Hank slowed the Chevy. They crossed a covered bridge over the river. The wooden planks of the bridge rumbled under the tires. There was a date carved into the beam above the entrance, 1849. The same beam carved by some long-dead carpenter, the same year a man named Asa Whitcomb was riding a horse through these hills, preaching at one-room churches and worrying about a family named Pickett that had just lost their father. Silas didn't know any of that yet. Past the bridge the town opened up, a white church with a steeple on the left, a small cemetery beside it where the gravestones leaned at angles, some of them so old the names had worn off and were just shapes in the stone, a post office about the size of a tool shed, a general store with a wide front porch and 2 rocking chairs, a few houses scattered along the road, most of them old farmhouses with metal roofs and stacks of firewood under blue tarps in the yards. Hank did not stop in town. He drove another half-mile out the south road and turned left onto a gravel lane between 2 stone walls. The lane went up through a hayfield that hadn't been mowed since June. At the top of the rise, set back from the road in a small clearing, sat an old farmhouse with a porch sagging on one corner and a barn behind it the color of dried tobacco. Hank parked next to the porch. A big yellow dog came out from under the porch steps. Old, slow, white around the muzzle. He walked over to the truck and put his head against Hank's leg when Hank got down. "Major," Hank said. He scratched the dog behind one ear. "This here's Silas. He's going to be staying a little while." The dog looked at Silas. The dog did not bark. The dog just sniffed Silas's hand and then turned and walked back to the porch and lay down on the top step like he was satisfied with whatever he had decided. Inside Hank's kitchen smelled like coffee and old wood and pine resin. There was a cast-iron wood stove in the corner of the living room, already lit, ticking softly as the metal expanded. A wooden chair sat next to the stove. A pipe sat in an ashtray on the chair's arm. A wool blanket was folded over the back. Hank set 2 glasses on the kitchen table. He took down a bottle from a cupboard above the refrigerator. It was a bottle of whiskey, more than half empty, the kind you get up here that doesn't have a fancy label. He poured 2 short fingers into each glass. He slid one across the table to Silas. Silas had never had whiskey before in his life. He picked it up. He sipped it. It burned all the way down. He didn't cough. Hank watched him over the rim of his glass. "You read that note," Hank said. It wasn't a question. Silas nodded. "Show me, son." Silas took the envelope out of his coat pocket. He set it on the table. He slid it across. Hank put on a pair of reading glasses he kept in his shirt pocket. He unfolded the paper slowly, like a man who had been waiting a long time for something and didn't want to rush it now that it was in his hand. He read it once. He read it twice. He took off the reading glasses. He set them on the table next to the note. He pinched the bridge of his nose between his thumb and his forefinger and closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet. But the tears did not fall. They just sat there. The way tears do in old men who learned somewhere a long time ago that crying out loud doesn't help anything. He cleared his throat. "Your daddy," Hank said, "saved my life on a winter night in February of 1995. I want to tell you about it. Will you sit and listen?" Silas nodded. Hank looked down at his glass. "Back then, I owned a little machine shop outside of Bristol. Repaired tractors and balers and the occasional snowblower. 28 years I ran that place. I had 3 men working for me. Your father wasn't one of them. He worked at a garage about a mile down the road. We'd see each other at the diner sometimes. He was a young man back then, 21 years old. Just married to your mama, I believe. You weren't born yet." Silas did the math. Frank was born in 1974. 21 in 1995. Silas was born in 2006. Yes. 11 years before he was born. His father, a young man younger than he was now, walking around the same towns fixing the same engines. Hank kept going. It was a Thursday, February 9th. Cold night. The kind of cold where the air feels sharp in your lungs. I was working late at the shop. I shouldn't have been. There was a customer's tractor I'd promised for Friday morning. I had a kerosene heater going next to the workbench because the main furnace was acting up. I went out to the office to grab an invoice. When I came back, the heater had tipped over. He stopped. He took a swallow of the whiskey. I tried to right it. Sleeve caught fire. By the time I got the sleeve off, the rags on the bench were going. By the time the rags were going, the old motor oil drums in the back corner were going. It was a wood frame building, 60 years old, dry as kindling. He took another swallow. I should have run out. Any sensible man runs out. But I had a file cabinet against the back wall. All my records were in there. Every invoice for 28 years. Every customer. My wife's name. My house deed. My insurance papers. Everything I owned in the world in one drawer, so I tried to get to it. He looked up at Silas. I was an idiot. He set the glass down. I made it to the file cabinet. I pulled the top drawer. The smoke came down. I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. I started crawling for the door. I thought I came in. I went the wrong direction. I crawled into a corner. I ran out of air. I just lay down. The room was very quiet. The wood stove ticked. I thought I was done, Hank said. I thought about Eleanor. I was sorry I hadn't called her after dinner. That was my last thought. He stopped. He looked at the table. He turned the whiskey glass a half turn. Then somebody grabbed me by the back of my coat. Silas didn't move. Your father had been driving home from work. He saw the smoke. He pulled in. He kicked the side door because the front was already gone. He came in low, on his belly, into a building that was actively collapsing. He grabbed me by the collar and dragged me about 30 feet across a concrete floor with burning rafters falling around us. Hank held up his left hand. When we got out, his right arm was on fire from the elbow up. The pinky finger on this hand, his left was crushed. A piece of the roof had come down on it. We never figured out exactly when. He didn't even feel it until later. Silas was looking at his own hands now. He was thinking about the long pink burn scar that had run down the inside of his father's right forearm. The pinky finger that never quite straightened out. He had asked once when he was small. He remembered his father smiling and saying long time ago, "Don't worry about it." "He pulled me into the snow," Hank said. "He rolled me. He rolled himself. He sat with me until the ambulance came from Bristol. I asked him his name. He told me, Frank Calloway. I asked him why. Why did you come in there? He just sat in the snow with his arm wrapped in his own shirt bleeding through it, and he said, because somebody had to. That was all he said. Because somebody had to." Hank picked up the whiskey glass. His hand was steady now. "He spent 6 weeks in the burn unit in Burlington. I went to see him every Sunday. He never asked me for one thing. I told him I owed him. He waved me off. He said, 'You don't owe me. You owe whoever you can pay back later. That's how it works.' Those were his exact words." Hank drank the rest of his whiskey. "I tried to give him money. He refused. I tried to give him a truck. He refused. I tried to put his name on the deed to the shop. He said no. He said, 'I don't want to be paid for it. If you really mean it, then one day when you've got something to give, you give it to somebody who needs it. That's the way.'" He set the glass down. 2 months before he died in 2015, he must have written that note. I never knew. I never knew he had a son until you walked into the Riverbend Diner 4 years ago wearing his face. Silas looked up. "You knew it was me. From the first morning, son. You never said. It wasn't my place. You hadn't come to me. The note hadn't found you. I waited." Silas sat very still. "You waited 11 years. Hank looked at him with those pale, washed-out blue eyes. "I waited as long as it took. A man finishes what he promised. Your father said that to me in the snow. I owe him my life. I've been carrying that debt 31 years. Now you sit at my kitchen table and you tell me you got nowhere to go. So you tell me, son, you think I'm going to let you sleep in your truck tonight?" Silas felt his eyes sting. He looked down at the table. He did not speak for almost a minute. Then he said very quietly, "What do I do?" Hank smiled. It was the first real smile Silas had ever seen on his face. "You eat," Hank said. "Then you sleep. Tomorrow morning we go to Goshen. I got a building to show you." That night, Silas slept in a small bedroom upstairs in Hank's farmhouse. A single bed, a wool blanket, a window that looked out over the hayfield. The wind in the trees outside sounded like a slow, steady river. He did not dream. In the morning, before the sun was fully up, Hank knocked on the door once and said, "Coffee's on." They drank coffee in the kitchen. Hank fried 2 eggs and a piece of ham and set the plate in front of Silas without asking. Then they got in the Chevy. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town on a 1/4-acre lot beside a stone wall. A single-story building, maybe 25 feet wide and 40 feet long, white clapboard over a stone foundation. The clapboard had faded in places and peeled in others, but the boards looked solid underneath. The roof was Vermont slate, dark gray, the kind that lasts 150 years. A small bell tower sat on the ridge of the roof, open, the bell long gone. 2 rows of tall windows ran down each side, the glass wavy with age, a few panes cracked, most intact. The front door was painted dark green, faded almost to black. It stood slightly ajar. A big sugar maple stood beside the building, its leaves just beginning to turn at the edges. Silas got out of the truck. He walked up the gravel path. He stopped at the stone step in front of the door. The step was worn in the middle from 100 years of children's feet running in and out. He put his hand on the door. He pushed it open. The light hit him first. 4 tall windows on each side, 8 in all, letting in long, bright rectangles of morning sun that fell across the room in warm shapes. The floor was wide maple plank, dusty, scuffed, solid. The walls were plaster, cream-colored. A green chalkboard was still mounted on the front wall, and next to it, tacked to the plaster, was a yellowed map of the world from 1962. 2 rows of wooden desks with cast-iron legs sat facing the chalkboard, most still intact. A pot-bellied stove in the back, rusted but whole, a small wooden cabinet beside it, a handheld brass bell on a shelf. Silas walked into the middle of the room. He turned in a slow circle. He could feel the history in the air. He didn't have words for it. He just felt it, the way generations of children had sat at those desks, the way a teacher had stood at that chalkboard every morning for years and done the most underrated work there is, the way the building had been waiting quiet for 58 years for somebody. Hank stood in the doorway behind him. Hank did not come in. "This was Edith's," he said. His voice was low. "My cousin. She taught here 22 years, from 1946 to 1968. They closed the school when they consolidated the district. She kept the bell. They never sold it. She kept it on her kitchen windowsill for the rest of her life." Silas turned. "What happened to her?" "She died in '95, Hank said. "About a month after your daddy pulled me out of that fire. She was 75. Lung infection in March. She lived alone, never married, never had children of her own. The town was her family." He looked at the chalkboard, then at the desks, then at the floor. "This building has been sitting here since '68, son. The county owns it now. They've tried to auction it 3 times. Nobody wants it. They're selling it today for $1 to clear the lien on the property." He looked at Silas. "I could buy it for you." "I won't. You're gonna buy it, with your own dollar. That's how it has to work. The rest, the labor and the patience and the help that I can lend you. The dollar is yours." Silas looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket. He took out his wallet. He took out a $1 bill, folded once down the middle, soft from being carried a long time. "Let's go see the clerk," he said. The general store sat on the main road across from the post office. Front porch, 2 rocking chairs. The bell on the door jingled when they walked in. The man behind the counter was 80 if he was a day. White hair, a flannel shirt with the cuffs rolled to the elbows, a pair of reading glasses on his nose with one of the temple pieces wrapped in black electrical tape. He was sorting receipts. "Hank. Toby. Brought somebody. Frank Calloway's boy," Hank said. "Silas." The old man behind the counter looked up. He took off the reading glasses. He looked at Silas for what felt like a long time. His eyes were brown, sharp, not warm yet, but not cold, measuring. "Frank Calloway's boy," he said. "Yes, sir." The old man held his gaze for another second. Then he glanced at Hank. The 2 of them held each other's eyes for maybe 3 seconds. Silas could not read what passed between them, but something passed. "He wants the schoolhouse," Hank said. Toby looked at Silas. "You sure, son?" "Yes, sir. You know it's got no power, no water, no septic. There's a crack in the foundation on the north side. The plaster's coming off in the back corner. The county would knock it down if they could find a use for the land." "Yes, sir." "Why do you want it?" Silas thought about that. He thought for a long moment. Then he said, "Because somebody has to." The room got very quiet. Toby Wren looked at him. He didn't smile, but something around his eyes softened, just a little. He opened a drawer under the counter. He took out a handwritten form. He took a pencil from a coffee mug full of pencils. He started filling out the form in slow, careful handwriting. Silas put the dollar bill on the counter. Toby looked at the dollar. He looked at Silas. He picked up the dollar. He put it in his shirt pocket. "Welcome to Goshen, son," he said. And then he glanced at Hank one more time. And one more time, just a flicker. Silas saw the same thing he'd seen behind Hank's eyes in the diner. Something old. Something that had been sitting there a very long time. Something that wasn't telling him yet. The first week Silas worked alone in the daytime. He tore the plaster off the back wall first. Mask. Gloves Hank had loaned him. Plastic sheeting on the floor. The plaster came off in big chalky chunks. Behind the plaster was the lath. Narrow strips of wood nailed across the studs. Behind the lath were the studs themselves, hand-hewn, solid spruce, and packed between the studs, stuffed into the wall cavities as insulation was old newspaper. Crumpled pages from the Burlington Free Press going back to the 1930s and 40s. Silas worked carefully. He stacked the newspaper in piles. He thought he might read some of it later. In the afternoons, Hank came. Hank did not work. That was the rule. Hank made it clear the first day. "This is your job, son. I'm just sitting." He brought a steel thermos of coffee. He brought a folded newspaper. He brought a rocking chair, the same one Silas had seen in his living room, and set it up in the corner near the pot-bellied stove. He sat there from about 2 o'clock until 5 o'clock, reading, sipping coffee, watching the dust drift through the long bars of afternoon light. His presence in the corner of the room was the steadiest thing in Silas's life, steadier than anything he could remember. The old man didn't talk much, didn't give advice, didn't praise. He just sat, and by sitting he said, "I am here. I will be here tomorrow. You can keep going." On the 4th day, Silas's hand touched metal in the wall. Cold, flat, rectangular, a tin tobacco box. He froze. He brushed the newspaper away. He pried the box free. He held it in both hands. He looked at Hank. Hank looked back. The old man did not speak. Silas opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in a piece of waxed paper, was a folded stack of paper money. Old bills, 10s and 20s, held together with a piece of cotton string. He counted it on the dusty maple floor in front of the rocking chair. $340. He looked up at Hank. Hank's face did not change, but his hand on the arm of the rocking chair was shaking, just slightly. "Keep going, son," Hank said. His voice was rough. "Keep going." Silas opened up the next stud bay. Another tin, the next bay. A glass jar sealed with wax. Coins and small bills inside. $510. The next bay. A tobacco canister. $400. He worked through the entire back wall over the next 2 days. Then he moved to the side walls. He kept finding them, hidden between studs, each one packed tight with newspaper, at different heights, as if somebody had been adding them over a long period of time, building a treasury inside the skin of the building. By the end of the 2nd week, he had opened every wall. He had pulled 23 containers out of the plaster and lath. He had stacked them on a piece of canvas in the middle of the room. Hank had sat in the rocking chair every afternoon, drinking his coffee, watching, saying almost nothing. The total, when Silas counted it the second time to be sure, was $29,700. That night, Silas sat across from Hank at the kitchen table at the farmhouse. The wood stove was ticking. Major lay under the table. There was a plate of beef stew between them. Silas said, "A teacher in 1946. How much did she make in a year?" Hank looked at his stew. $1,200, he said. Maybe 13 by the end of the run. How did she save almost $30,000, Hank? Hank did not answer. He chewed slowly. He looked up. You're getting close to the right question, son. But you're not there yet. He went back to his stew. The town began to come to the schoolhouse. They came slowly. The way small-town people come, they brought things. A man in his 70s named Earl Whitcomb came on a Tuesday morning with a wooden rocking chair in the bed of his pickup. He said his father had built it in 1923. He said it deserved to be in a room that had a fire in it. Silas helped him carry it inside. Earl looked at the canvas with the tin boxes piled on it. He glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds. He did not stare. He just nodded very small and walked back out to his truck. A woman in her 80s named Mabel Greer came that Thursday with a braided rag rug, 6 feet across, that she had made herself in the 1980s. She set it down by the stove. She glanced at the canvas. 2 seconds. The same small nod. A couple, Walter and Ruth Hadley, both in their 70s, came on Saturday morning with a black and white photograph in a wooden frame. The photograph was from 1965. It showed a woman standing in front of a chalkboard. In this very room. She had iron gray hair pulled back in a bun, a blue dress, a piece of chalk in her right hand. The classroom in front of her was full of children, maybe 18 of them, looking up at her with absolute concentrated attention. The woman was Edith Vance. Walter said his older brother was in the 3rd row, second from the left. He said Miss Vance taught his brother to read in this room when his brother was 6. He said his brother went on to become a high school principal in New Hampshire and retired last year. He said it was because of her. They glanced at the canvas. 2 seconds. Small nod. Silas, by the end of that second week, had figured something out. Every one of them had looked at the money. Not one of them had asked about it. He told Hank this at the kitchen table that night. Hank said, "Keep watching, son." And then on a cold Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October, while Silas was sanding the maple floor near the front of the room, the green door pushed open, and a man in a clean wool coat with a leather briefcase stepped inside. He had a thin smile. He said, "Mr. Calloway, I'm Hollis Brandt, Selectman, Addison County. I understand you've recently acquired this property." Silas turned off the sander. The room went quiet. Hollis Brandt looked around. He looked at the chalkboard. He looked at the photographs on the wall. He looked at the canvas in the corner where Silas had moved the tins, covered now with a piece of old quilt. His eyes lingered on the quilt for a second longer than they needed to. "I've had some inquiries from constituents," Hollis said. "Concerns about the transfer, permits, procedures, renovations on a property of historical character without a permit can get complicated. I'd like to see the certificate of sale, if you have a moment." Silas wiped his hands on a rag. He went to the cabinet where he kept the certificate. He brought it back. Hollis Brandt took it. He read it slowly. He turned it over. He read the back. He handed it back. "There may be a technical issue," he said. "I'll have to review it. I'll be in touch, Mr. Calloway." He turned to leave. His eyes passed across the corner of the room. They stopped. Hank Vance was sitting in his rocking chair near the stove, holding his coffee cup. Hank did not stand up. Hank did not say a word. He just looked at Hollis Brandt. Hollis Brandt's face did something. The smile stayed, but everything behind it went for 1 full second, completely still, like a deer that has just heard something move in the brush and is deciding whether to run. Then Hollis nodded once at Hank. A small nod. The kind you give a man you cannot afford to ignore but do not want to greet. He walked out of the schoolhouse. The green door closed behind him. The room was very quiet. Silas turned to Hank. "You know him?" Hank looked into his coffee cup. "His daddy did some bad business in this town in 1958, Hank said. Edith was the one who caught him at it. Edith was the only person in this town with the spine to make him pay it back. Hollis was a small boy then. He grew up in the shadow of that. Some men carry their fathers like a coat. Some men carry their fathers like a chain." He looked up. "That man over there, he's been waiting 40 years for a chance to settle a score with a dead school teacher, and now he's looking at her schoolhouse, and the boy who bought it for $1, and a pile of tins in the corner, and he's thinking maybe the score is finally going to settle in his favor." Silas felt something cold in his chest. "What's he going to do, Hank?" Hank set his coffee cup on the floor next to the rocking chair. "He's gonna come back," Hank said. "Probably with paperwork, probably with 2 men from the county office. He's gonna say you didn't declare the contents of the property. He's gonna say under Vermont abandoned property law the contents revert to the county. He's gonna try to take it from you." Silas stood there in the middle of the schoolhouse, with sawdust on his hands and the pile of tins under the quilt in the corner, and felt the floor of his life tilt just a little bit. "Hank," he said. His voice was quieter than he meant. "What's in the tins? What is this? Why are people coming in here and looking at it and not asking? Tell me, Hank." Hank picked up the coffee cup. He took a sip. He set it back down. He stood up. He was slower standing than he used to be. He walked across the maple floor, past the chalkboard, past the desks, until he stopped in front of Silas. He put his hand on Silas's shoulder. His hand was big, heavy, warm through the flannel. "Tomorrow night," he said. "Toby Wren's store. 7 o'clock. You ask me in front of the whole town what you just asked me, and you'll get your answer." He squeezed Silas's shoulder. "It's not my story alone to tell, son. It belongs to all of us. It's been belonging to all of us since 1881. He let go. He walked back to the rocking chair. He sat down. He picked up his coffee cup. The afternoon light moved slowly across the maple floor, and Silas Calloway, 20 years old, with a pile of tin boxes under a quilt in the corner, and a selectman's threat hanging in the air, stood in the middle of a one-room schoolhouse in southern Vermont, and understood finally that he had walked into a story much older than his father, much older than Hank, much older than the building he was standing in. A story that started in 1881, a story that a whole town had been holding for 145 years. And tomorrow night at 7 o'clock in a general store in a town of 287 people, that story was finally going to open its mouth. Silas did not sleep that night. He lay in the small upstairs bedroom at Hank's farmhouse and listened to the wind move through the bare branches of the sugar maple outside the window. The wind was not loud. It was the kind of wind Vermont gets in late October, when the leaves are mostly down and the trees stand quiet, and the world feels like it's holding its breath before the snow. He thought about his father. He thought about a young man 21 years old, the same age Silas was, about to be walking into a burning building on a winter night because somebody had to. He thought about the long pink burn scar. He thought about the pinky finger that never quite straightened out. He thought about the chalkboard in the schoolhouse, the bell on the windowsill, the pile of tins under the quilt in the corner. And he thought about the look on Hollis Brandt's face when the man had glanced at the quilt. Silas understood lying there in the dark that whatever was about to happen at Toby Wren's general store the next night was bigger than him. It was bigger than the schoolhouse. It was bigger than the $29,700. It was the thing Hank Vance had been waiting 11 years to give him. He just didn't know what it was yet. The general store was full at 6:45. Silas had not expected that. He drove the Ford Ranger up the gravel road from the schoolhouse around 6:30. He could see the lights from a quarter-mile away. Trucks parked along both sides of the road, more trucks than he had ever seen in Goshen at one time. He counted 22 before he gave up. Hank was waiting on the porch with Major the dog. "Come on, son," Hank said. They went inside. The general store had a wide center aisle with shelves of canned goods on both sides. At the back, behind the counter where Toby Wren usually sorted his receipts, there was a small open area that had been a feed and grain room 100 years ago. Folding chairs had been set up there, maybe 30 of them. Most chairs were full, men, women, mostly old, a few middle-aged, 2 or 3 young. Faces Silas had seen at the schoolhouse and faces he had not. When he walked in, the room got very quiet. Every head turned. He recognized Earl Whitcomb in the front row, Mabel Greer 2 chairs over, Walter and Ruth Hadley in the second row holding hands, Bernie from the diner of all people sitting against the back wall in his work shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He must have driven 60 miles after his shift. Toby Wren was standing behind the counter with his reading glasses on. He looked up. "You're here, son. Come on up." Silas walked the length of the aisle. Hank walked behind him. Major padded along at Hank's heel and lay down in the open space when they reached it. Toby pulled a chair out for Silas. Silas did not sit. He looked at the room. "I came here," he said, "because Hank told me I should ask a question in front of all of you, the same question I asked him last night." The room was so quiet you could hear the wood in the stove behind the counter ticking. "What's in the tins?" Silas said. "Why is the whole town coming to look and nobody's asking? What is this? Tell me what I walked into." Toby Wren took off his reading glasses. He set them on the counter. He folded his hands. He was 80 years old. His hands were big and brown and creased like leather that had been soaked and dried 100 times. "Son," he said, "sit down. This is going to take a minute." Silas sat. Toby Wren looked out over the room. "All right," he said. "It's time. Some of you in this room have known this story your whole lives. Some of you only know pieces. Tonight, on account of this young man, on account of what Hollis Brandt is trying to do, we're going to say the whole thing out loud for the first time in 145 years. He took a breath. "It started," he said, "in the winter of 1881. The room did not move. There was a family in Goshen back then named Pickett. Father, mother, 5 children. The father caught pneumonia in November. He died before Christmas. The mother was left with 5 children, no money, and a Vermont winter ahead of her. The town was poor. There was no insurance. There was no Social Security. There was no government to call. There was just whoever lived on your road." Toby looked at Earl Whitcomb in the front row. "Earl, you want to say it?" Earl Whitcomb stood up. He took off his cap. He held it in his hands. He was in his late 70s. His shoulders were stooped. His voice was thinner than Toby's, but it was steady. "My great-grandfather, Earl said, was the minister at the white church up the road, Reverend Asa Whitcomb. He walked door to door that December, 1881. He collected $18 from the families on this road. He brought it to Mrs. Pickett in an envelope. He set it on her kitchen table and he said, 'You don't owe anybody this, but when the time comes you give back what you can to whoever needs it next.'" He paused. Mrs. Pickett kept her children alive that winter. The next summer she sold honey from her bees and wool from 2 sheep. She walked back up the road to my great-grandfather's house. She put $20 on his kitchen table. She said, "For the next one." Earl sat down. Toby took it back up. "That envelope," Toby said, "never stopped moving. 1882. It went to a family named Coombs. Their barn burned. The fund rebuilt it. They paid back $22 2 years later. 1893 it came to my family. The Wrens. My great-grandfather lost a leg to a saw at the mill. The fund kept us on our farm. We paid back $40 over 6 years." He looked around the room. By 1900 the fund had a name, the Hollow Road Fund, named for the road this town sits on. There was never any paperwork. There was never a bank. There was just one person in each generation who held it, and they passed it on when it was time. He looked at Silas. 1932, my grandfather lost both legs in a sawmill accident in Brandon. The fund put $1,000 in our mailbox. We almost didn't lose the farm. My father paid back $2,000 over the next 20 years. Mabel Greer raised her hand. "My grandmother," she said, "took out $15 in 1919 when my grandfather had the flu and couldn't work. She put back $30 in 1924. Walter Hadley said from the second row. "My father's tuberculosis treatment in 1947, $450. He paid back $600 over the next 10 years. A man in the back gray hair denim shirt that Silas didn't know said, "My wife's first chemo in 2004. $1,200. We paid back $2,000. A woman next to him said, "Our roof in 2014 after the ice storm. $3,000. We're still paying." A younger man, maybe 40 in the third row, said, "My boy's surgery last year, $8,000. We're starting to pay." Silas sat there. His mouth was a little open. The room kept going, one person after another, just speaking quietly. The decades stacked up like cordwood. 1890, 1910, 1928, 1944, 1963, 1986, 2001, 2019, 2024. 145 years of small disasters and small rescues. Not one written contract, not one bank, just a road, a town, and an envelope that never stopped moving. Toby Wren lifted his hand. The room got quiet again. "Every generation," he said, "had a keeper. Someone who held the fund. Someone who knew where it was. Someone who decided with one or two others to keep them honest when it should go out and when it should wait." He looked at the floor. The keeper's son are always people the town can trust completely. They have to be quiet. They have to have nothing to hide. They have to have no children of their own who might fight over it later. Mostly over the years they've been people who lived alone. He looked up. From 1881 to 1909, the keeper was Reverend Asa Whitcomb. From 1909 to 1946, it was a man named Silas Pickett, who was the youngest of those 5 children Reverend Whitcomb saved in 1881. He grew up to be a stonemason. He kept the fund in a metal box in his cellar for 37 years. He had no children either. Silas felt the back of his neck go cold. His name, Silas. He had been named for his great-grandfather. His mother had told him that once before Frank died, and he had not thought about it in years. Toby kept going. In 1946, Silas Pickett on his deathbed passed the keeper's role to a young woman named Edith Vance. She had just come back to Goshen after finishing teacher's college. The town had paid her tuition out of the fund 2 years earlier, after her 2 brothers died in the influenza wave of 1944. She owed her schooling to the fund. She wanted to pay it back. He looked at Hank. Hank was looking at the floor. He was not crying, but his face was a particular kind of still. The still that old men get when they are looking at something nobody else in the room can see. "Edith," Toby said, "didn't trust banks. None of us did. She was a child of the Great Depression. So she did what Silas Pickett did, except she did it better. She hid the fund inside the walls of the one building in town that nobody could move, nobody could burn, and nobody would ever search." He looked at Silas. "The schoolhouse." Silas closed his eyes. He saw the tin boxes in his mind, 23 of them, hidden between studs, at different heights, tobacco boxes, mason jars, cloth pouches, the careful decades-long work of one quiet woman building a treasury inside the skin of a building she stood in every day in front of children with a piece of chalk in her hand. She kept the fund there from 1946 to 1968, Toby said. 22 years. The town fed it during good years. She gave it out during bad ones. She wrote no records. She trusted her memory, and she trusted my grandfather, who was her co-witness until he died in 1965. After that, she trusted me. I was 35 years old. She brought me in. I have been part of this for 61 years, son. Silas's voice was very quiet when he spoke. What happened in '68? Toby took a long breath. The state consolidated the schools. They closed her one room. She fought it. She lost. The county took the building. She had 2 months before the doors were going to be locked. She did not know who the next keeper would be. She did not know if there would ever be another teacher in that building. She made a decision. She left the fund in the walls. She wrote a letter. She sealed it behind the chalkboard. She trusted that the building would outlast her. She trusted that when somebody who needed it came along the building would let them find it. He paused. After the school closed in '68, the fund stayed in the walls. She and my grandfather had agreed to leave it. Not many calls on it came in those years. The town was getting by. Edith and I checked the walls twice a year very quietly, spring and fall. We never moved a tin. We just made sure the building was holding. He looked at Silas. She was right. The building held. The whole room was looking at Silas now. Silas could not feel his hands. "My father," he said. He cleared his throat. "Hank, tell me about my father." Hank stood up. He stood up slowly. He was 74. His knees gave him trouble. He stood up anyway. He looked at the room, and then he looked at Silas. "Edith Vance died in March of 1995, Hank said. She died in her sleep at 75 years old. The town buried her at the White Church, but before she died, she'd been weak that winter. She knew her time was short. She'd brought me in 2 years before, in '93, to start taking over the keeper's role alongside Toby." He paused. 1 month before Edith died, in February of 1995, the fire happened in Bristol. Silas already knew this part, but he listened anyway. "Your father pulled me out of that fire," Hank said. "He saved my life. I tried for months afterward to give him something. Money, a truck. He refused all of it. The last time he refused, he said to me, 'You owe me nothing. You owe whoever you can pay back later. That's how it works.'" Hank's voice did not break, but the room was so quiet you could hear the wood in the stove. I was already standing in for Edith as the new keeper, just me and Toby. The fund was sitting in the walls, untouched, waiting, and here was a young man 21 years old who had walked into a fire to save a stranger, and who refused payment, and who said the words "how the fund works," without ever having heard of the fund, without ever having heard of Edith Vance, without ever having heard of Goshen. Hank looked at Silas. "I knew that night, son, standing in the snow watching the ambulance take your father away with his arm bleeding through his shirt. I knew that whoever this young man was, whoever his children would be, they were the line the fund was waiting for." Silas could not speak. "Edith was gone a month later. She never met your father, but I told her in the hospital that the fund had found its next chapter. She squeezed my hand. She knew. She died at peace." The room let out a soft breath. "I went to Burlington every Sunday for 6 weeks, Hank continued. "I watched your daddy heal in that hospital bed. I learned he had just gotten married. I learned his wife was expecting. I never told him about the fund. I had no right. I just waited. 11 years later he died. I came to the funeral. I stood at the back. I did not introduce myself to your mother. I saw a 9-year-old boy in the front row holding his mother's hand, and I knew I was looking at the next chapter." He took a breath. "I waited 11 more years for that boy to grow up. I waited for him to find his way to the Riverbend Diner. I waited 4 more years, sitting in the same corner booth every morning so I could see his face and hear his voice and learn what kind of young man he was becoming. Toby and I agreed. We agreed I would say nothing until he came to me. We did not steer it. We did not push. We let the building do its work." Hank looked around the room. On the afternoon of his 20th birthday, his stepfather threw him out of his house. He sat on a cardboard box at the end of his driveway. He called me. He had nowhere else. He turned back to Silas. "That phone call, son, was your father finishing his promise, through you. He told me 31 years ago I would pay him back by giving to somebody who needed it later. The somebody was always you. He just didn't know it. He couldn't have known it. He wrote that note in 2015 because he was a careful man, and he wanted you to know my name when the time came. He died not knowing it would be you, but it was always going to be you. Some debts take a generation to finish." He looked at the floor. "The fund chose you, Silas. The building chose you. We just sat in our chairs and waited for you to walk through the door." The room did not move. Silas felt his eyes burn, but he did not cry. He had not cried in 11 years. He was not going to start tonight. He looked at Toby. What happens now? Toby Wren put his reading glasses back on. He picked up a leather-bound book from a shelf behind the counter. The book was old, cracked. It looked like it had been rebound more than once. Hollis Brandt, Toby said, is going to file a claim against the schoolhouse. He's going to argue that what you found in the walls is abandoned property and reverts to the county. He's going to argue that you didn't declare it. He's going to argue you forfeit the building. He set the book on the counter. He's not going to win, because this, he tapped the cover, is the ledger. Every keeper for 145 years has signed it. Every withdrawal and every payback for 145 years is in it. Reverend Asa Whitcomb's signature is on page 1, Silas Pickett, Edith Vance, my grandfather, me, Hank, we are about to add you. He opened the book to a clean page. This isn't abandoned property. This is a private trust, documented and witnessed across 6 generations of named individuals. We're going to bring this ledger to the county hearing. We are going to bring every person in this room, and Hollis Brandt is going to find out on the record that his father stole from a fund that fed this town for 40 years, and that his attempt to retaliate against a 20-year-old boy is going to be in the public record forever. He looked up at Silas. You ready to sign? Silas stood up. He walked to the counter. He looked at the book. The handwriting on page 1 was faded brown ink. Asa Whitcomb, 1881. The page was thin and brittle. Every page after it had names and dates and small amounts. He saw Edith Vance's signature in the middle of the book, slanted, careful, the handwriting of a teacher. Toby handed him a pen. Silas Calloway signed his name underneath Hank Vance's, on a fresh line, dated October 2026. The room let out a breath. Then they all stood up. One at a time, every person in that general store walked past Silas and shook his hand. Earl Whitcomb, Mabel Greer, Walter and Ruth Hadley, Bernie from the diner, who did not say a word, just nodded and gripped his hand and let go. 28 people. He did not know most of their names. By the end, he did. The hearing was held 2 weeks later in the county courthouse in Middlebury. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled walls, tall, narrow windows that let in the cold November light. There were maybe 50 folding chairs set up in front of the bench. Every chair was full. Townspeople from Goshen filled 4 full rows on the left. Earl Whitcomb wore a coat and tie that looked older than Silas. Mabel Greer carried a knit handbag and her grandmother's wedding ring on a chain. Walter and Ruth Hadley sat very close together. The county clerk sat at a small table on the right side. The judge was an older man named Beecham, bald on top, white around the ears, reading glasses on a chain. Hollis Brandt argued for 40 minutes. He used phrases like reversion under abandoned property statute and undocumented informal agreement and lack of fiduciary standing. He wore his clean wool coat. He had a folder of typed pages. He referred to Silas as the claimant the whole time. He referred to the fund as the alleged contents. He never looked at Hank, not once. When Hollis was done, Toby Wren stood up. He did not bring a folder. He brought the ledger. He set it on the table in front of him. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed them on his flannel shirt. He put them back on. Your Honor, Toby said, I'd like to read from page 1. He opened the book. He read in his slow, careful voice the very first entry. December 1881. Reverend Asa Whitcomb. $18 to the Pickett family. Signed in faded brown ink at the bottom of the page. He turned the page. He read the next entry. 1882. The Coombs family. Their barn. $22 repaid. He turned the page. He kept going. He did not read every entry. He read about 15. From every decade, spanning 145 years. By the time he was halfway through, the courtroom was completely silent. Then Earl Whitcomb stood up and testified that the book had been in his great-grandfather's possession in 1881. He brought a photograph of Reverend Asa Whitcomb. He brought a letter from 1879 that the Reverend had written to a parishioner. Mabel Greer stood up and testified about her grandmother. $15 in 1919, $30 paid back in 1924. She held up her grandmother's diary open to the page where it was recorded. Walter Hadley stood up. He spoke about his father's tuberculosis, the $450 in 1947, the $600 paid back. He had his father's old shop receipts as documentation. 11 other people from Goshen got up and testified, one after another, each one with their own year, their own family, their own piece of paper, their own small contribution to the same long line. By the time the last witness sat down, the judge was leaning forward on his elbows. He had not interrupted once. The county's own attorney, a man in his late 60s named Holcomb, listened to all of it with his hands folded on the table. When Hollis Brandt got up to give his rebuttal, his voice was thinner than it had been the first time. He tried to argue procedure. He tried to argue statute. He tried to argue that even if the fund was real, the contents in the walls had not been declared at the time of sale. He spoke for 9 minutes. When he was done, Mr. Holcomb took off his glasses. He set them on the table. He looked at the judge. Then he looked at Hollis Brandt. "Mr. Brandt," he said very quietly, "I sat in Edith Vance's classroom in 1962. I am familiar with the character of the person who kept these records. This is a private trust with documentation and witness across 6 generations. The county has no claim. We are done here." Judge Beecham nodded once. He banged his gavel. The room exhaled. Hollis Brandt did not look at Silas as he gathered his folder and his briefcase and walked out of the courtroom. He did not look at anyone. Outside on the courthouse steps, a young reporter for a local paper asked Hollis what had driven him to pursue the case. Hollis Brandt did not answer. He got in his car. He drove away. Hank told Silas later on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the leaves come off the maple. "He'll be all right, son. He'll be smaller now. Some men need to be made smaller before they can be good again. Maybe he gets there. Maybe he doesn't. That's not for us." Silas thought about that for a long time. The rest of October went into the building. Silas wired it himself with help from an electrician out of Brandon who took half his usual rate when he found out who Silas was. The plumber came down from Middlebury and did the same. The town fund voted on by the witnesses paid for the materials. Silas signed for every nail and every length of copper pipe and entered it in the ledger. He framed the bathroom in the corner. He tiled the shower walls himself with small white hex tiles. He learned to mud drywall. He learned to set a window plumb. He kept the chalkboard. He kept the pressed tin ceiling. He sanded the maple floor on his hands and knees over 2 weeks. 2 coats of oil-based polyurethane. He let it cure for 5 days with the windows open. The first time he walked across it in his socks after the cure was done, the floor was so smooth it felt like glass. Hank sat in the rocking chair in the corner most afternoons. He read his newspaper. He drank his coffee. He almost never gave advice, but he was always there, from 2 to 5, every day. On the 7th of November, the first snow came. It was the kind of light Vermont snow that comes early. Big, slow flakes drifting through the bare branches of the sugar maple beside the schoolhouse. The kind that doesn't stick to the road, but settles on the slate roof in a thin, clean blanket. Silas stood at the front door and watched it for a long time before he went back to work. A week after that, on a Thursday morning, the postmaster from Goshen drove up the gravel path and knocked on the schoolhouse door. He had a letter for Silas. It had come addressed to Silas Calloway, care of Toby Wren General Store, Goshen, Vermont. The handwriting was his mother's. Silas took the letter inside. He sat down at one of the school desks. He opened it. It was short. Silas, I am not coming back. Dale doesn't know I'm writing. I was wrong about you starting when you were 11. I am not asking you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know I still remember the day you were born. Don't write back. Your father would be proud of who you've become. Mom. Silas read it twice. He folded it. He stood up. He walked across the maple floor to the wall beside the chalkboard, where the photograph of Edith Vance hung in its wooden frame, where the photograph of his grandmother also hung, the schoolteacher from New Hampshire he had never met. He took down a small frame from the cabinet that he had been saving. He put his mother's letter inside it. He hung it on the wall next to Edith and his grandmother. He did not forgive her. He did not hate her. He just put her on the wall, where she could be, the way the dead and the gone get put on walls. Then he went back to sanding. Hank died on the 22nd of December. He had walked over to the schoolhouse that morning with his thermos and his newspaper, the way he had every afternoon for the last 3 months. Silas had built him a small wooden footrest. Hank had grinned when he first saw it and said, "Now you're showing off." That morning was cold, below 20 degrees. The wood stove was burning hot in the corner. Hank had taken his boots off at the door. He had unfolded his newspaper. He had said, "I'll have this read in 20 minutes. Then I'm gonna want a refill." He had patted Major on the head. Major had lain down next to the rocking chair. Silas had stepped outside to bring in more firewood. When he came back in, Hank's head was tilted slightly forward. His eyes were closed. His coffee cup was on the floor beside the rocker. The newspaper had slid off his lap. Major was sitting up very still, looking at Hank's face. Silas set the firewood down by the stove. He walked over. He knelt down. He put his hand on Hank's hand. The hand was still warm, but the pulse was not there. The doctor came up from Middlebury an hour later. He said it had been a stroke. Quick. Probably painless. Hank had likely been gone within a minute of feeling anything. He was 74 years old, and the doctor said it was the kind of way a man hopes to go. In his own chair, with his own dog at his feet, in a building he had helped bring back from the dead. Silas sat with him until the ambulance came. He did not move Hank. He just sat in the desk closest to the rocking chair. Major lay between them on the maple floor. The wood stove ticked. The light came through the tall windows in long, bright shapes that moved very slowly across the floor as the morning passed. Silas did not cry. He just sat there. He had been the son Hank Vance never had for 6 months, and Hank had been the father Silas had lost when he was 9. And the months they had together at the end were the way Frank Calloway, lying in a hospital bed in Burlington in October of 2015, had managed to keep one last promise to his boy. A man finishes what he promised, even when he is gone, especially then. The funeral was at the White Church in Goshen, 3 days before Christmas, snow on the ground. The pews were full. Bernie drove down from the diner in a dark coat that did not quite fit him anymore. Even the attorney Holcomb came, in a black suit. He stood in the back with his hat in his hand. Toby Wren gave the eulogy. He kept it short. He talked about Eleanor. He talked about the machine shop in Bristol that had burned down in 1995. He talked about the way Hank had carried a debt for 31 years and finished paying it in the last 6 months of his life. He looked at Silas as he said this last part. The whole town turned and looked at Silas too. Silas stood up at the end. He had not planned to speak, but he walked to the front of the church and he stood beside the casket. He put one hand on the wood. He looked out at the room. "He was a good man," Silas said. His voice was steady. "He finished what he promised. That's the highest thing anybody can say about a man. He finished what he promised." He sat down. The church was quiet. After the service, Toby Wren walked Silas out to his truck. He put a hand on Silas's shoulder. "You're the keeper now, son," Toby said. "You and me, just like Hank and me, just like Edith and my grandfather. You ready for it?" "Yes, sir." "You'll be ready longer than that. The fund doesn't ask much of you most days. Some years it just sits. Then one year somebody needs it and you act. You act small. You act quiet. You write it in the book. You let the next generation know in their own time." Silas nodded. "What about Hank's house?" he said. "He left it to you, son. He showed me the will the week before he passed. Major, too. The whole place is yours." Silas got in the truck. He sat there for a long time before he turned the key. January came hard. Vermont January. Below zero most nights. The schoolhouse held the heat better than any building Silas had ever lived in. The pot-bellied stove burned around the clock. The pressed tin ceiling radiated warmth back down. The maple floor was so smooth under his socks it felt like glass. He opened the schoolhouse to the children of Goshen on a Saturday afternoon in the second week of January. It was not a formal school. It was a workshop. Free. Open to anyone. Earl Whitcomb came twice a week to teach small engine repair. He brought an old lawnmower and an old chainsaw and let the kids take them apart on a tarp on the floor. Mabel Greer taught sewing on Thursdays. 2 grandmothers and 4 granddaughters showed up the first week. Toby Wren taught local history on Sundays after church, the way Edith would have wanted. Bernie drove down on Saturdays. He taught 2 teenagers how to make bread. The smell of yeast and butter filled the schoolhouse on those afternoons and reminded Silas of every breakfast he had ever cooked in his life. Silas taught carpentry. He brought Frank Calloway's red Craftsman toolbox from Hank's farmhouse and set it on a workbench he had built himself along the back wall. He lifted out the level, the wrenches, the chisels, the little brass-handled awl Frank had used to mark dowels. He held up the level for the first 3 kids who showed up. A 9-year-old boy named Eli, a 12-year-old girl named Sarah Coombs, a 7-year-old boy named Wyatt, whose father had died last year. "This belonged to my father," Silas said. "It belonged to his father before him. A man holds his promises with these. Look down the edge. Tell me if the wood is straight." Eli closed one eye and squinted down the pine board. He looked up. "It's straight, mister." Silas put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Yes, it is," he said. "Now you'll always know how to tell." The boy looked at the level for a long moment. He ran his finger along the brass edge. Then he looked back up at Silas with the same concentrated attention that the children in the 1965 photograph had given Edith Vance. Silas understood standing there that this was the work. This was the only work. On the night of the 20th of January, after the kids had gone home and Silas had banked the stove for the night and locked the schoolhouse door, he walked back into the building one more time by lamplight. He carried a small tin box. The box was new. He had bought it that afternoon at Toby Wren's general store. Inside it were $200 in 20s, folded carefully, wrapped in waxed paper, tied with a piece of cotton string, and inside the box was a folded note in his own handwriting. For the next one. SC 2027. He walked to the north wall. He set the lamp on a school desk. He pried up a section of baseboard he had loosened earlier that day. He reached into the wall cavity, the same wall cavity on the same spot where Edith Vance had placed her very first tin in 1946. He set the box gently between the studs. He packed crumpled newspaper around it. He nailed the baseboard back in place. He stood up. He looked at the wall for a long time. Then he picked up the lamp and walked to the front door. He paused with his hand on the handle. He looked back across the maple floor, at the chalkboard, at the rocking chair Hank used to sit in, at the photograph of Edith Vance, at the framed letter from his mother, at the photograph of his grandmother. He spoke very softly. He did not know who he was speaking to. Maybe his father, maybe Hank, maybe Edith, maybe all of them. He said, "I finished it." He turned off the lamp. He went outside. The snow was falling slowly through the dark, big, slow flakes, the kind that don't melt when they land. The sugar maple beside the building was bare and black against the sky. The covered bridge over the river was a dark shape across the field. The white church steeple was barely visible through the snow. Silas Calloway sat down on the stone step in front of the schoolhouse. Major the dog came up beside him and sat on his haunches. The old yellow dog leaned against Silas's leg and looked up at the snow. Silas put a hand on the dog's head. He looked up at the falling snow. A small, dry voice, the voice he had been hearing in his own head since he was 6 years old, said very quietly the words his father had once said in a basement in Burlington, with a level lying across a piece of pine. A man doesn't have to say much. He just has to finish what he promised. Silas Calloway, 20 years old with $1 in his pocket 6 months ago, and a town behind him, now sat in the falling snow on the stone step of a schoolhouse that had been waiting 58 years for somebody, and he understood that a man's life is not what he gets. A man's life is what he hands forward. His father had handed him a promise. Hank had handed him a debt paid. Edith Vance had handed him a building full of tin boxes and a town full of witnesses. And one day, when his hands were old and his hair was white, and his children, if he had them, were ready to listen, he would hand it forward too. To somebody he did not know yet. To somebody the building would choose. That was the work. That was the only work. A schoolhouse is a place where people learn to become themselves. And sometimes on the right night, on the right stone step, under the right falling snow, a young man learns that becoming himself means becoming what his father promised. The bell in the small wooden tower above the schoolhouse roof. The bell that had been silent since 1968, the bell Edith Vance had kept on her kitchen windowsill, and that the Hadleys had brought back the week before in a felt-lined wooden box moved very slightly in the cold wind. It made a small, clear sound. Just once. Then the snow kept falling, and the lights in the schoolhouse windows, the soft yellow lamplight from inside, fell out across the snow in long, warm rectangles. The building looked alive. Not the way a building looks alive when people are moving around inside it. The deeper way. The way a building looks when somebody has finally come home. Major leaned a little harder against Silas's leg. Silas kept his hand on the old yellow dog's head. The snow kept falling. The lamplight kept glowing. And somewhere down in town in the back of Toby Wren's general store, the leather-bound ledger sat on a shelf with one new signature on the most recent page. And the long, slow circle that had started in 1881 with a reverend and a widow and $18 in an envelope kept right on turning. The way it always had, the way it always would, quietly, from one generation to the next, hand to hand, promise to promise, man to man. If this story moved you tonight, take a moment and subscribe. Share it with somebody who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, who in your life kept a promise to you? We read every one of them. Good night, friends. Drive safe out there.